But I did all the different missions that the F-16 does. You don't want to fight when you don't own the skies. Europe had its head in the sand like an ostrich for the last 30 years. If you let a dictator like Putin grow, it's like a weed and it just grows and grows and grows and takes over your yard. So they're going from being dependent on Russian gas to being dependent on Chinese solar panels, windmills, and batteries. He gave Elon Musk a couple $100 million, you'd have a module in a year, I'm sure. We should stop flying our astronauts on the Russian. 3 cosmonauts that I flew with are now in the Duma. So I flew with them just a few years ago. They're in the Duma promoting the war. The war in Ukraine is more important than the ISS.
Welcome to my weekly Ukraine Today. We're going to talk about geopolitics, about technology, about everything related to Ukraine. And I'm extremely happy and honored to say hi to Terry Virts. Hi, Terry.
Hello, Jaanika. It's good to be with you.
Terry Virts is astronaut, part of Endeavour launch in 2010, commander of ISS with over 200 days in space and 3 spacewalks. He was also a test pilot for the F-16 fighter jets that are so wanted by Ukraine right now. Currently, Terry is a consultant for energy and defense companies, popular public speaker, author of the books, and amazing photographer. Please find links below and hit that subscribe button.
God, you have so much interesting experience, but I think let's start with the one thing that is most interesting probably for many people who are following Ukraine. It's of course about the jets, the fighter jets. You've been a pilot for fighter jet. And it's exact model what Ukraine is like praying for and saying that please close our skies, please help us to liberate the territories. Why it's so important?
Well, I wish we would have done that a year ago, since we promised Ukraine in 1994 that we would protect you after you gave up nuclear weapons. So that I don't think that's going to happen. You know, NATO jets are not going to come and do that, unfortunately. But in the interim, Ukraine has an air force. You have very brave pilots. You have fighter jets. And look, in the long term, Ukraine is going to fly F-16s. You're not going to fly in the year 2030. The Ukrainian Air Force is not going to be flying Russian jets. In the year 2040, you're going to be flying NATO jets. So at some point, this is going to happen. Getting new airplanes requires a lot of training, and it's not just the pilots. The pilots need at least a month, you know, and probably a few months before they're really proficient. But the maintenance guys have to learn how to do it, and there's specialized equipment to work on the electronics. And there's a big logistical tail. A typical U.S. Air Force base will have several thousand people, and only 100 of them are pilots. And, you know, everybody else is supporting the jets. So it just takes time to get that to happen. In the interim, the real thing you want is the weapons that the jets fire, not the jets themselves. And so they've already integrated some Western missiles are working on the MiG-29 that you have. There are other weapons that we could, you know, integrate. You know, you could launch them from a MiG-29. It won't have all of the capabilities. You might not have sensors that see what you want to see, but that I think that would be a good short-term solution. That could be done very quickly. I'm sure people are already working on that. But Jaanika, a lot of these things, if we should have started it on February 25th last year, or we should have started it on February 25th of 2014 is when it should have started, or March or whenever. And so unfortunately, it just takes time. Like tanks, you know, you need modern tanks are going to do really good work there, but it's going to take a few months, and the Russians are already starting their offensive, right? So we need to get that sense of urgency. That's what I've been trying to promote, is a sense of urgency.
So how important it is to have these jets, or is it enough to have missiles to be supporting the offensives? For example, when Ukraine say that we need to liberate territories, we need to like cover the sky or secure the sky. Will we cope with just the missiles, or are the jets like must have also?
Well, the F-16 does I did all the different missions that the F-16 does. It does air to ground. It can support Army units. It can go deep and do something called interdiction to take out targets hundreds of miles. It can do suppression of enemy air defenses with a HARM missile. That was my mission when I was in Europe, which the MiG-29s can do that to a certain extent. But the MiG-29 is not going to be great at air defense. So if you want to protect the skies from Russian airplanes. The Russian airplanes are probably going to outmet, they just have longer range missiles and so on than the Ukrainian airplanes. Although if the Patriots get there, again, they should have been there a year ago. That would really help shut down. The Russian jets are not going to fly where Patriots are. So the thing about air superiority, the American military has not fought a war without air superiority since World War II. Like every battle that American troops have had in the last 80 years, we've owned the skies. You don't want to fight when you don't own the skies. I mean, Ukraine has learned this, right? So having air superiority can be in part from the Patriot or from surface to air missiles, but you also need jets to have that air superiority that you want. It also allows you not only to defend yourself, but also attack. When you have a battle on the ground, the troops, you can fight them in close contact, but you'd much rather fight them 50 kilometers in their rear, take out all their gas and all their logistics and all their weapons, and then you don't need to worry about fighting them in close. And that's the kind of thing that air power lets you do. So I hope they will get there. The question is how long. And unfortunately, you can't just send F-16s and next week be using them. It takes a little bit of time for that to happen.
But you're very much also into geopolitics, and this is where I wondered. So the question is that it is so surprising that many people expected, or many even analysts and countries expected, that the new world war will be about technology, that it will be very high tech and very like modern technology, weapons, and so. And here we are, basically the World War I or World War II style of battles,
Yeah.
and only drones flying high, but still it's very low tech, surprisingly.
Look, high tech is an important component of it, but at the end of the day, you need boots on the ground. You need infantrymen with guns to walk into a town and liberate it or take it over, depending on what side you're on. And there's this idea of combined arms or joint operations where it's not just infantry, but it's infantry plus artillery, plus armor, plus mechanized armor, plus aviation, plus space. A lot of intelligence comes from space and plus cyber. Ukraine has done amazing things. I just saw a Zoom call that you hacked and you caught a bunch of traitors through the Zoom call. And so you need if you want to fight well, and you need to combine all of those different things. But the drones are great, but unless you have infantry on the ground and artillery supporting them, you're not going to take over anything. And this is a full-blown war. I mean, we haven't seen a massive scale war like this since Korea. I think the Korean War was the last giant army on army engagement that we've had. And Jaanika, I think the most important thing from the big picture is that people's eyes have been opened. Europe had its head in the sand like an ostrich for the last 30 years. We thought, oh, the Soviet Union's gone. They haven't been spending money on defense. We're seeing now a lot of the big countries in Western Europe and these huge economies don't have a military. Their military is just hollowed out and very weak. And so I think their eyes are open like, wow, if you let a dictator like Putin grow, it's like a weed and it just grows and grows and grows and takes over your yard. And then all of a sudden he's waging trench warfare in Europe. So I hope the eyes opening is the best thing. In the long run, I think he's strengthened Europe. I think he's strengthened freedom. And the world has certainly seen the character of Ukraine. But in the short, and unfortunately in February 2023, your boys on the ground are going to have to fight it out in close combat, and a lot of people are going to die. That's the unfortunate consequence of us having our head in the sand.
Yes, talking about the head in the sand, I believe that if we would have reacted sooner, like after the Georgia, like after the Syria, after the Azerbaijan, there are even the same people, who are fighting before and now. If we would have hit with the real sanctions, maybe we wouldn't be here now.
Yeah.
But you're also very much into energy. So, we have this great plan to shift to renewable energy, but then some European countries are saying, how can we do that actually? That we have to be free of Russian energy. That means sometimes use coal and very, let's say, not so modern technologies. Same
Right.
time, you want us to be like clean and sustainable and so on.
Right.
So I will be intriguing. If we will have to choose, let's postpone a little bit our environmental goals because now we have war ongoing. What will
Yeah.
be priority?
Yeah, for sure. You've heard of Maslow's hierarchy of needs.
I studied it at school.
Oh, really? Yeah. If you don't have security, you can't have anything else. This is why countries in Africa are such a disaster. Countries in the Middle East are sometimes a disaster because they don't have basics. They have to worry about a suicide bomb going off. And so how can you develop a high-tech computer ecosystem when guys are blowing themselves up, you know? And so with we have to have that physical security before we can have clean energy. But the problem with the renewable, I think it's a false choice, because what a lot of European countries are doing, and Australia says they want 92% wind and solar by the end of the decade, which is crazy. They're just becoming dependent on China. So they're going from being dependent on Russian gas to being dependent on Chinese solar panels, windmills, and batteries, especially batteries. Electrifying cars means we're becoming dependent on China. Not only dependent on them, we're also sending them hundreds of billions of dollars of business to strengthen them. We're strengthening the Chinese Communist Party in the name of green energy. And what China does is they mine these minerals that they need in Africa in terrible environmental conditions, or in South Asia. They process all the materials in coal-fired plants in China. And so, and then the electricity has to come from somewhere. And unless you're making renewable electricity, that, Europe, well, Germany specifically had this amazing nuclear power grid that was made in Germany. It was emissions free. You had to deal with nuclear waste, but in the big scheme of things, it's not killing anybody. It's not that bad. And they went from that to being dependent on Russian gas. And I think the story of how that happened, of guys like Gerhard Schroeder that have just become basically, like, the former premier of Germany is basically a Russian agent. It's insane. And so I think we need to open our eyes. We need to pull our head out of the sand and what's happening with energy. Because I work in the energy industry. Actually, I'm a part-time energy guy, and I'm a big fan of not polluting. I don't want to pollute. We need to move away from that, but we need to do it in a rational, insane way that doesn't go from being dependent on Russia and Saudi Arabia and there's a lot of countries that are not our friends that we're dependent on for oil, to being dependent on China for the same stuff. So we just need to be smart about how we do that.
Yes, you mentioned the dependency, and Germany was like 60% dependent of the Russian gas, yet they managed to cut these ties very, very fast.
Which is good. Very good.
Absolutely, and surprising, because it was like, oh, we cannot do it so fast. Well, we found out they could. But do you think Europe has now shifted totally away from Russian oil, meaning that even in 5 years, we won't be coming back that, okay, they're not in Ukraine anymore, maybe we can continue our business as it was?
So there's two questions about the Russia thing. I think, first of all, Qatar has unlimited natural gas. America has a lot of natural gas. In 2014, when I was an astronaut, I launched on a Russian Soyuz that year. My first thought, and what we should have done at the time, is build out infrastructure to bring American gas to Europe. We should have hit Putin where it hurts and undercut his energy. We didn't. We had an ideology in our political system that was oil and gas is evil. We can't grow it. Which dictators are evil. Oil and gas is good in some ways, bad in some ways, but dictators are evil, and that's the ideology that we need to have. So that was something that we should have done. I think there's enough gas. There's gas in Ukraine. Ukraine has very good reserves of oil and gas. Unfortunately, a lot of it is occupied by Russia right now, but once you get rid of them, there are reserves there. There's reserves in Poland. And I think Mr. Putin has been very effective in manipulating European politicians so that those reserves do not get explored and developed. I guess I'll leave it at that. I've talked to lots of folks in the European energy industry, and they've been pretty clear that Russia is not a big fan of that, and neither is the European Union because of environmental reasons. And so you could be energy independent and you're not. And how is that working out for the continent? I hope these eyes are open. Again, I think the theme of today is let's open our eyes, let's pull our head out of the sand and kind of prioritize like freedom, security, and then everything else after that.
And having said that, you know Russia quite well. You speak Russian. You have been in Russia or lived in Russia for many years because of the Soyuz mission. So is it like fitting your pattern, let's say, or did you see it coming, or were you like extremely surprised as half of the world? Or
I was so hurt, personally hurt, because I love my Russian friends. I love the food. I love the culture. I love the language. I really kind of fell in love with Russia. And I spent the last 5 years promoting like, hey, we're working together in space. And I've always thought Russians are kind of like Texans. They're very practical, and we should be friends with them. And it should be Russia and the West against China. But there's something about the culture there, Jaanika. I remember the first thing I did was this language immersion program, and I was there for May 9th for their Victory Day, Den Pobjedi. And I remember thinking, this is kind of weird. It's kind of cultish. Like, it's everywhere. And yes, you help beat the Nazis, which is great. But like, that was 70 years ago. Like, let's move on with other things have happened. And so my very first instinct was something really weird is happening here. And it's also very obvious that there's a lot of propaganda, and most Russians don't completely believe the propaganda. They know the state lies, and they dealt with Soviet they knew not to trust the communists, but there's so much of it, it really warps their brains. Like, if you're living in Russia, you sort of believe, at least in part, some of what Putin is saying is true. And it's incredibly disturbing to see an entire population. There's a funny and crude word to describe it, but their mind is not right. And the other thing about the Russian culture, I mean, for a century, they have lived in slavery. They live under dictators. There aren't rights. They don't have the First Amendment, freedom of religion and press and assembly and all the things we have in America and in Western Europe. And so they just, and their attitude isn't like, and some of them like Putin. There's 20 or 30% of them that are true believers, but most of them either oppose him or they're ambivalent. They're like, I don't really like him, but it's not my place. A typical Russian response would be, this is not my job. He's the boss. He decides what happens. And I'm Russian before anything else, so I'm going to support Russia. If Russia's at war, I'm going to support Russia. It's not like they would have chosen to invade Ukraine on their own, but since the boss is saying that, then they just follow it. And culturally, I don't know how you undo that. Like, what if Alexei Navalny was suddenly escaped and somebody and Putin was gone and he became president of Russia? Would you suddenly trust? This is a question for you. Would you trust Russia? Then you have Ukrainian and Baltic roots, so you know firsthand what it's like to live with Russians.
Because it is programmed somewhere, as you mentioned, deep down. It's centuries of imperialistic thinking. It's not just one person.
Americans don't know what it's like to live under the Russian thumb or the Russian boot, but Ukrainians do, the Baltics do, right? And what is that like when you're the Estonian SSR?
It's much easier to understand when you have relatives who have been sent to Siberia somewhere, where you have like hundreds of people murdered, killed, imprisoned, and not during one era, during like different. It was now Putin. Before that, in Soviet Union, it was like whole nations were destroyed, their ethnicity, their languages. Basically,
Right.
Estonia, when it was invaded by Soviet Union, like all the military personnel was killed or sent to Siberia. It was hundreds of all the government scientists, poets, and so on, and it continued for tens of years. And before that, it was Tsar, so
Yeah.
no democracy to go back to.
There was in Poland there was the Katyn massacre where they killed tens of that's their MO. They go in, they kill all the smart people, and they're, you know, and then there's just workers left. And so there's a century of this. And the other thing that struck me about the World War II worship, and it's a religious cult thing, and Putin has been really promoting that because that's a way for him to keep control of the population. Like, we need to do this for our grandfathers. Our grandfathers fought, and we need to do the same. It's propaganda. It's Goebbels 101. But the Russian story in World War II is not good. Like, yes, they fought Nazis, and that was good with America's help. And yes, they took huge amounts of casualties, but most of them were because of Stalin. Had they had a good government, they would have had millions and millions and millions of less casualties. And that's something that is conveniently forgotten. Like, Stalin killed roughly as many people as Hitler did. And so that's forgotten. You know, the thing that they're worshiping as good and right is not good and right. And they had a pact with the Nazis. I mean, Stalin was friends with Hitler, and they came in and divided up Poland and maybe the Baltics. I don't know the history there, but like, the reason the Soviet Union was so capable in that part of the world is because they were friends with Hitler. And so the truth is they should be proud of their grandfathers. A lot of men and women suffered and helped defeat Hitler, which is good. But man, that's a complicated history, to put it mildly.
Same
It's
time,
sick.
sorry, moving away from history a little bit. Same time, I see a helmet, I see a space shuttle there.
Yeah.
And still, while we're saying that we should stop all the business with Russia, we should stop trade with Russia, the cooperation in space continues. Cannot we really replace the Soyuz and the Russian missions with our Crew Dragon, or don't we really have alternatives other than to knock on Roscosmos door?
Yeah. So I've written about this. I wrote an op-ed. The space station has an American segment, which is America, Japan, Europe, and Canada, and then a Russian segment, and they're attached. And so if you're going to operate the space station, and I think we should, it's this massive, important spaceship, you have to work with the Russians to some extent because they're attached to it. And they have the rocket engines, which is used to maintain the orbit and also help rotate the space station. You have to have rocket engines of some kind. And we decided 20 years ago to cancel our rocket propulsion module and just depend on the Russian module. And it worked great until now, right? And it still works. And so if we wanted to be completely independent of them, we would need to build a rocket propulsion module, which could be done if you gave Elon Musk a couple $100 million, you'd have a module in a year, I'm sure. And had we done that when I said a year ago, the module would be ready to go now, but it's not. But the other thing that we're still doing, we're still flying Americans on the Soyuz to launch people to and from the station, and we're flying Russian cosmonauts on our capsule. And in perfect world, that's the way you want to do it, because you always want to make sure you have a Russian and an American, and that helps you make sure that that happens. However, we have SpaceX now, and Boeing is going to launch this year, hopefully. And so we should have two different capsules. And so as long as the next capsule launches before this capsule comes down, there will always be Americans on the space station. And if you had to go a few weeks without an American on the space station, that's not the end of the world. I think I've been very vocal about we should stop flying our astronauts on the Russian, because it means that not only does the astronaut have to go there, but usually their family goes over to watch their launch. NASA has to keep a whole contingent of people in Russia to support the launch. Are they going to get locked up and sent to jail as spies? I don't know. Or this happens all the time in Russia, right? It would be very easy for them to make up something and arrest them. So we're putting our NASA's people at risk. And what we're doing by flying on a Russian Soyuz, it's kind of like going on an expedition to Antarctica with German scientists in 1943. I mean, I'm sure there are good German scientists and there were good Germans. My family's German, but you don't cooperate with the German government in 1943. And NASA has stuck its head in the sand and they're pretending like nothing has happened, nothing's changed. Let's be friends and buddies and we'll just keep on working. And the three cosmonauts that I flew with are now in the Duma. So I flew with them just a few years ago. They're in the Duma promoting the war. They just had 3 cosmonauts on the space station, did a greeting for the Russian soldiers fighting in Ukraine from the space station. Like, we need to disengage from that. If the Russian government changes, if they want to promote peace again, then let's cooperate in space. But my God, we don't cooperate with China for good reason. And I think we need to begin the process of disengaging from Russia. It's very frustrating for me. And the war in Ukraine is more important than the ISS. That's just the bottom line.
Thank you. And knowing how important is ISS for you, you spent
Yeah.
there 200 days.
Yeah. I risked my life twice, 7 months. I love it. I love the ISS, and we should continue to fly the ISS. I'm not saying we should just, destroy the ISS at all. I'm just saying we need to start backing off on our cooperation and launching Americans on the Soyuz. And I've talked to people at NASA here in Houston, and their quotes have been, "Man, I used to love going to Russia. I hate it now." Yeah, for so many reasons, we need to change things, but I'm not in charge. No one asked me.
But what many people probably don't know is that lots of space heritage, Soviet space heritage, comes from Ukraine. Because in Ukraine, there are huge cities that are building like different parts of the rockets. They're still there, like Dnipro and Yuzhmash.
Dnipro, yeah.
Yes. Do you think that Ukraine could have this private space, not a legacy, but future?
Yeah, for sure. I think, well, Ukraine will, I'm sure, have a role in the space industry. You've built rocket engines, you've built rockets, you've had lots of cosmonauts. The guy I flew with last, Anton Shkaplerov, is from Sevastopol, which is Ukraine, by the way. He says that it's not, but he's wrong. So Ukraine has a very rich space history, and I think the future is bright. Ukraine's not a great place for a launch pad because in general you have to launch east, and you have like countries to the east. Or you could launch south, but there's Turkey and Africa to the south. So the launching into orbit, that's why they do it from Kazakhstan, because there's hundreds of kilometers of nothing. Or that's why we do it from Florida, because there's the Atlantic Ocean. Or from California, because you can launch south over the Pacific Ocean. So I don't think Ukraine's a great place for an orbital launch pad, but it's a great place for manufacturing, engines, satellites, equipment. You have a lot of talent there. You have a lot of engineers who understand rockets and space. Or it could be for private space flight, for suborbital space flights, it would be a great place, especially Eastern. I remember seeing Eastern Ukraine from space. There's like hundreds of kilometers of farm fields there, and they're all, you can see the lines. They're like all these rectangles. There's hundreds of kilometers of rectangles, like thousands of rectangles. In the wintertime, they're white and you see the black outline. I remember the image vividly. So I think Ukraine's going to have a future in space for sure.
Yes, it's amazing that actually we have our first tech or space unicorn, because the Firefly that has launched its first flights, their founder is from Zaporizhia, close to Dnipro, and the huge research center is in Dnipro, like hundreds of people. Still, even factories like printing out the parts of rockets in 3D printers, huge 3D printers.
I did not know that. Firefly, the founder, is Ukrainian. Wow.
Well, let's say it was a company that was originally from Texas, probably, but it went bankrupt. So Max Polyakov from Zaporizhia bought it, and actually Alpha is his brainchild. He's from the family of rocket scientists, really, like from Kharkiv, and his PhD in let's say rocket science, engineering.
Yeah, of course.
So and now also they're working with Ukrainian scientists because of this huge legacy, because of Yuzhmash and this that you mentioned.
You know what's interesting, Jaanika? mentality, the Russian mentality is very Soviet. In fact, one of the problems with the Soyuz now is that like some guy designed some piece of equipment in the 1960s and all those, and he's been the man since the 1960s, and all those people are dying now or they're gone. So they're actually having a real problem because the people that designed the things are now gone. But Ukraine, it feels to me it's a lot more Western. It's a lot more startup culture. You're able to integrate. I'll tell a quick story. In the German Air Force, when East and West Germany came together, the Luftwaffe tried to integrate East German pilots and they couldn't. They were not able to fly. Their mentality was so structured, so Soviet. Don't make any decisions, just do what you're told. They literally, no East German pilots were able to they all had to retire. And I saw this with Hungarian pilots and stuff. But the Ukrainian soldiers now, and many of them are not soldiers, they're computer programmers or college professors, whatever. You literally have the whole nation, right? But you just integrated immediately. And I think Ukrainians should be training NATO because you guys have learned so much. You and I have talked about how to use drones and stuff. So what I'm saying is there's something about the Ukrainian mentality, I think, that's very innovative and, startup entrepreneurial in ways that maybe others are not. Yeah.
This is why you call them MacGyver army. The US
Yeah.
commanders are calling, because we have used to making something out of nothing, because
Yeah.
there were never available, the technologies, the spare
Yeah.
parts, so on. So we had to glue it together and make it happen, basically. But yes, Ukrainian
Yeah.
technology is just amazing, because we have like 300,000 pool of IT specialists, like approximately 10 unicorns. Maybe someone is using Grammarly or GitLab. And then this is huge potential, really. The engineering is very strong.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's something I think that's look, 2023 sucks, but 2025 is going to be better and 2030 is going to be better. And so I think the future of Ukraine for sure is very, very bright. I think the future of Russia has basically been ended, has been doomed by Vladimir Putin. That one leader, his ego, his evil, he's an evil human being. It has put the nation on a downward trajectory for the next century, I think. And so this is tough right now, but I know the future is going to be much brighter for Ukraine.
You sound a lot about values, and I know that you have really great values, meaning that you had a lot of time to think, you had a lot of time to develop your leadership skills, and I really much like what you said about that by the end of the day, after the mission ends, you have to really like these people, which means that what are your main lessons learned?
Well, yeah, so leadership, I do public speaking is that's how I make money. That's like my profession now, in part anyway. And I talk about leadership, and I've got a bunch of different things. One of the things is praise in public and criticize in private. So if you have a team, if something's not going right, go, hey, you need to start doing this better. But when it's in public, or and if the team does something well, give credit to the team. If somebody screws up, talk to them privately and don't criticize them in private or in public. I think you have to know your people. If you are an Army sergeant and you have a platoon full of 18-year-olds, you don't give them any choice about anything. You tell them when to put their boots on, and you tell them everything. They don't have any whatever. Then if you have 20, 21-year-olds, then you start giving them some ability to make their own decisions. And if you have experienced team members, then you just go to them and go, hey, here's the problem. How are we going to solve it? And let them tell you how to solve it. And so there's a spectrum. When you have the new person, you tell them what to do. And when you have experienced people, you listen to them, and you have to know where you are on that spectrum. As a space station commander, I had a bunch of astronauts. So I never, unless there was an emergency, if there was an emergency, then the commander's in charge and he tells what to do. But on a normal day, we had some problems with the recycling system. I would just say, hey guys, we're having this problem. What should we do? And 100% of the time, somebody had a good idea. And so we just did that. I think if you're in that situation, the best leader is a little bit lazy, like let your people do their job and get out of their way. So you just have to know where you're at. And sometimes you'll hire someone when they're young and you tell them what to do all the time, and you need to let them grow and change over time. So the leader needs to be very smart about where they're at on that spectrum.
I absolutely resonate with you. I worked for like 3 years with the mayor of Dnipro. He is absolutely brilliant. And I always describe our cooperation as his principle was the less I see you, the better. As you mentioned about responsibility, giving responsibility. And so the last questions will be blitz, meaning that I haven't warned you about them. If we can keep it short and sweet.
Okay.
Does God exist?
Yes.
Do aliens exist?
Probably.
One book that you would recommend?
Between Shades of Gray. Ruta Sepulveda. It's about Lithuanians' occupation during the Soviet times.
And your book?
How to Astronaut, of course. What am I thinking? That's the book I should have recommended. It's a great book. Read it by the pool, read it by your bed. It's 51 short chapters about spaceflight. It's a lot of fun.
And written by Terry. Yes.
It's written by me. Yeah, I did not have a ghostwriter. I wrote it myself.
One movie you would recommend?
Interstellar.
The Meaning of Life.
To Serve Others.
When Ukraine will win?
Soon.
Thank you, Terry. It's been pure gold and amazing. Truly enjoyed as always. Thank you.
This is great, Jaanika. You do a great podcast. I can't wait to see it come out.